We all know now that board committees exist to assist the board in superintendence, direction, and control. Are they doing enough or merely going through the motions and thoughtlessly legitimizing management action? Our panel now will discuss board committees and how to make them count, and includes Mr. Amit Chandra, the Managing Director of Bain Capital Private Equity, and serves on boards of directors and on advisory boards of a number of companies, and is active in the not-for-profit space. Bain Capital, incidentally, set up its India office 10 years ago and is a financial and business services vertical. And Mr. Chandra used to earlier head global markets and investment banking at DSP Merrill Lynch. Mr. Arun Nanda hardly needs an introduction. He's the chairman of Mahindra's Lifespace Developers and Mahindra World City Developers, as also the founder and chairman of Mahindra Holidays and Resorts India. He serves on boards of directors and on advisory boards of several companies and on the governing board of HelpAge India. Formerly, Mr. Nanda was the executive director and board member of Mahindra & Mahindra and has held several roles in compliance, corporate governance, investments, strategic planning, etc. Mr. S. Shandilya has been quite vocal through the day, suffering from a bad cough as he is. He's the chairman of the Eicher Group. Prior to becoming its chairman, he was the managing director of Eicher Motors and handled group finance and strategic planning. He's also a member of the governing body of the Quality Council of India and the National Council of CII, as well as the board of Lean Global Network USA and the chairman of Lean Management Institute of India. Mr. Chandelier will moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Rita, for the introduction, and good afternoon. Am I audible in the last line? Am I? Okay, that's great. Nice to see the hall being full in the afternoon session. Normally post-lunch session, I think people go for a short nap, but I think here people are awake and attending the session. Nice. It's my privilege to be moderating this session on board committees, make them count. Nice to have Amit and Arun as panelists. When Mr. Damodaran chose this topic, I don't know what he really meant. Did you mean how many days and months they have to count? To be there in the committee or not? Probably not. Okay. Having said that, I think I will leave it to the panel to start with, or I will come in and chip in with my comments at a later point. Can we start with Arun in case points that you want to share as initial thoughts?
You know, I have two problems. One is I'm sandwiched between two very wise people. And third is the previous session was so interesting and it had some controversial issues, so there was interest. So, you know, I'm starting with a very low mood, so you have to excuse me on that. Honestly speaking, you know, having served on boards for 30 years, you know, the transition that we have seen in the last 5 or 7 years is very different from what we saw. Now, taking the current topic, I think the most important thing that we need to think about is that there was a time when it was ticking the boxes. Currently, the responsibilities of independent directors have gone to probably the other extreme. Means, if I may slightly distract, you can't take independent directors to court even before they are produced. We saw that in a PSU bank that they took 3 people. We saw in the case of a real estate company, their personal assets were frozen. Now, these are things which, but you know, there is never a full truth or a half truth. Things lie somewhere in between. So the point that I was trying to make is that the first 2-3 things that come to mind is the constitution of the committees. You know, it should, if you are dealing with a risk committee or an audit committee, I think it is very important to have people who understand these, and also it's not only competence, it's also availability of time. I think that is a problem that we do see, that we do manage to get very eminent people to come on the board. We do manage to get very well-meaning people come to board, but when although the Companies Act has brought down the number of directors, we do find that people are starved for time. So the first point I go back to is that the composition of the committees is very important. And when you look at composition, it is the capabilities of the or the experience of the individual directors. Do you want to bring what sort of people on, because everybody has different expertise or different strengths. And the third is, will they be able to devote time? The second point is that I think those days when you had the thing that you just ticked the boxes and you went away are gone. One of the things that I learned from Deepak Parekh, and I'm sorry to use his name in his absence, he always insisted that the audit committee should be previous day, because I don't want the pressure of the board meetings starting at 2 o'clock. So he always insisted that the audit committee should be in the afternoon of the previous day, so that I don't have. The other thing is that people have to understand that they have not only a statutory responsibility, there's also a moral responsibility which comes with it. And to me personally, when I sit on boards, that's a very large, because there are millions of shareholders or hundreds of thousands of shareholders who invest in companies based on what the composition of the board, who are the promoters, etc., besides the product. So, when I was talking to Mr. Damodaran, when he first rang me up, he picked up a very interesting article, this thing, and I must confess in public, I hope there's no media here, that while I am very conscientious, but in this one, he found me on the wrong foot. He was saying that take the stakeholders committee. Normally the way company secretaries put up stakeholder committee agenda is whether compliances have been done. There's a compliance this thing. They will tell you what were the complaints received, what was the thing, was there any whistleblower, etc. Tuck. Now, after I spoke to him, I realized that the stakeholder committee has a far deeper responsibility than people normally think the stakeholders committee is. Does communicating, although I don't like independent directors to go and talk out of turn, but at least they can ensure that communications of important matters are. This, Mr. Damodaran, I thought after you spoke to me, and that I'm confessing, I've sat on boards for 25 years, I've sat on stakeholders committee, but we looked at mostly from a compliance point of view, and we made sure that the compliance vis-a-vis SEBI, vis-a-vis or addressing their grievances was done. But one thought which came to mind is that if we see any red flags, if we see anything, isn't it our responsibility as stakeholder to make sure that this information, and these days getting to them is not very difficult. You don't even have to call anything. You just make sure that you disclose it on your website or give an intimation to SEBI, and stakeholder committee can insist that this can be done. The third thing which is there is that, in the previous panel you heard about this accounting policies and the internal audit, and these are. I think the audit committee task is the most onerous of all committees. And there, again, I'm using Deepak's name. Most companies place audit committee, they will send you the agenda, but the accounts are placed at the audit committee itself. They take the plea that, how can we do it? Deepak would not sit in an audit committee till the papers were sent a day before to him, the accounts, and he had a chance to see it. And he wanted to meet the CFO before that. I'm just picking up little examples to say that things have changed, and if we want to be good independent directors, if we want to be proud of our companies having good governance, I think we have to think deeper than what appears as what are the responsibilities of this thing. Now, there is a provision in the Companies Act. I'm sorry, I'm probably taking the thunder from you, but just to give the point to this thing. There's provision in the SEBI guidelines about risk management. Now you take a case like the biggest financial disaster that we said. I want to know what was the risk management. Forget anything else. What was the risk management? Having so many subsidiaries and your net worth, if you take contingent liabilities out, was negative. They talk of that, NBFCs have to have less up to 1 to 10. But if you have contingent liabilities or if you have claims over some government body which are not acknowledged as debt, don't you think it was the responsibility of the risk management or the audit committee to go? See, I'm sorry, I may sound a little repetitive, but I'm an accountant, just looking at accounts and making sure that the accounts are presented as per the guidelines, as per the IFR, the Ind AS, etc. is not enough. We are now seeing that a company had so many subsidiaries, it had debt, if you take, which is, even on the books of it, it was huge. What was the audit committee or what was the risk management committee doing in that sort of thing? So I am saying that your responsibilities are far deeper than what is prescribed in the statute or in this thing. And it is not very difficult. I think it can be very easily achieved if you pick up the right people and make sure you give them right information and enough time to go through that. I'll come back later to take any questions, so I'll let the wiser one speak now.
I'm not sure about that, Arun, but I think it's going to be a tough act to follow. Look, I think we live in somewhat troubled times, and that has really raised the bar for all of us to, perform. And I don't think the industry, by and large, has really earned its stripes over the last few years. We've actually created much of a trust deficit by the way boards in general have performed. And I think, therefore, forums like this actually become really important, and what we can do to, in terms of real specifics, to, do a better job on boards, I think becomes extremely important. Some of the points that you made, therefore, Arun, are extremely important. In terms of, specifics, I think that come to my mind. Look, first of all, I think all of us at boards who have sat on boards realize that over the years, being a board member means facing far greater degree of complexity. You see greater complexity in regulations. You see greater complexity in the environment, which some of it means needing much more depth risk management skills. You see all other kinds of complexity, be it cultural complexity, often, especially as companies have become more multicultural in terms of, some they've gone to different countries. You see cybersecurity becoming a big issue that, people need to deal with. And when you overlay all of these, I think, the management teams are often facing amazing amount of complexity to deal with. And we as board members who are really sitting and working with them need to really think about, what kind of a job they're doing to ensure that they are on the right track. So I think the first and most important thing I think of is how have we really equipped ourselves to judge the companies that we are working with in thinking about, are they really equipped to deal with some of these complex issues, including, for example, something relatively as basic as risk management. And I think that is actually a very important issue. Sometimes it means just calling in external experts, who can help you assess some of these things, because often as a board member, I have found myself very inadequate in dealing with some of these things. And I have realized, therefore, over the years that it's important for board members to simply have the common sense to identify what are the different issues that are relevant to a company, and then for the relevant companies to, committees to really have the ability to rely on external experts, and importantly, to have the budgets to rely on external experts who can really come in and help committees and board members assess important issues, okay? So sometimes, for example, you raise the issue of a particular company that was facing a simple issue on asset liability mismatches. I think it's, it's important sometimes to just get an external perspective on something as basic as that, because, that could easily have been flagged off in an independent assessment, which was done, because something that was staring in the face. Or, I know that one board that I sit on, which faces massive cybersecurity threats, we actually had the ability to call in a retired FBI director who did a, assessment and told all the board members how we should be thinking about cybersecurity risks and how we should be working with the management team on dealing with that. We could never have the ability otherwise as board members to really think about that. So I think dealing with complex issues by relying on experts, because we will never become experts, is the fact. And managements are far more better equipped to deal with these issues, but if we want to really help managements deal with these issues, if we want to be effective board members, I think our ability to rely on experts and be better informed, in my mind, becomes really critical. And for that, I think, we need to effectively be equipped, have the ability to spend money independently, and, be able to direct some resources becomes an important point. I think the second issue is somewhat related, which is, if you want to be able to do all this, the role of independent committees becomes identifying some of these issues, which is what are really the relevant issues in different companies that need addressing, and you need to sit down with the chairman or CEO, or sometimes both if it's split, to identify a list of critical issues and have some sort of schedule through the year that will get addressed at different meetings. If it's a company that spans many continents, trade wars become a very important source of risk. You'll suddenly discover that, a trade war is sending currencies haywire, tariff barriers are suddenly impacting your P&L. And so it becomes really important to be able to rely on the right experts to help understand, is this going to be a 2-year issue? Is it a 20-year issue? If it's going to be a 2-year issue, how do you need to reorganize your supply chain or your balance sheet? And so I think it becomes important to identify those, 4, 5, 6 issues and calendarize them. And I think that becomes the role of committee heads and the chairperson / CEO. And so that becomes the second issue in my mind. I think the third issue, which at the risk of repeating myself, I'd like to underscore what you said. It has become so important in my mind to think about, substance over form. I think when I think about blow up over blow up, you realize that in pretty much all those cases, if you really go out and do an audit, people pretty much must have checked the boxes in most of those cases. Yet there have been blow-ups. And I think that's really because people have not really stepped back and thought about issues with just simple, in some cases, simple common sense. The example you gave in many ways was a commonsensical example, right? If you deduct contingent liabilities from someone's net worth, is commonsensical, right? So I think substance over form is such a big issue that I think all of us need to really step back and think a little bit more deeply about. I think the fourth issue, which I'd like to highlight, is again an important issue. Look, all of us, when we go to, many of us would have gone to business school, some are accountants, but certainly all the management literature that we read about the success of companies, what drives shareholder value, what is the source of risk in companies, we realize that a big factor is essentially leadership, right? Now, if that is correct, then the key role of boards obviously is to be able to change leadership when they see things going wrong, or certainly be able to challenge leadership before things really explode. We must ask ourselves how many boards actually do that. Most cases, boards actually derive their power from the CEO or the chairman or chairwoman. And because of that relationship, I think that in pretty much most cases that I'm aware of, they don't really have a very constructive relationship where they can actually challenge each other. If they do challenge each other, it's mainly a one-way traffic where very gently a chairman or CEO can ask someone to retire, which also happens very rarely ahead of term. But I think the other way around is truly an exception, and when it does, it creates a lot of noise. But that, in my mind, is one of the biggest disconnects that exists. And so in private companies, if it can happen, why in public companies should it not happen? And I think that's a big issue that we should really ask ourselves, that, how do we really make sure that boards have a relationship that doesn't really derive from the power equation that exists because someone is appointing someone, but really out of the ability to engage each other in a constructive dialogue that ensures the well-being of the organization and of all shareholders.
Can I add?
Sure, please.
There are 2-3 things which come to mind as Amit was talking. I think the first and foremost thing is I'd like to ask my friends who are either company secretaries or chairs of various committees, how many times have we really questioned the agenda? I think that is the starting point. Because typically, as he said that there are 2 classes of people, there are MBAs and there are accountants. I am one level lower. I am also company secretary. So you get mails from various departments, we need board approval for that, and that is how the agenda is prepared. I'll give you an example of what happened only yesterday at a board. It's not it's a not-for-profit, but a very large government-private sponsored, one of the Prime Minister's prime objective body. I found that sanctions were 1100 crores and disbursals are 130 crores. And these numbers are all floated on the Man Ki Baat and all that sort of things. Now, normally you will pass that, but the question is, that is the relevance, the question that came to mind is the relevance of this going down? We are 11 months in the year. If the sanction is 1100 crores and the disbursements, so there can be, and to the credit of the committee, they insisted that we want a board meeting with just to specifically to discuss audit committee. No, I'm just saying that do we ask ourselves what should be in the agenda?
I think that's a good point, Arun. I think both Arun and Amit have really highlighted the importance of the various committees and how they should function to make a meaningful contribution to the board of the company. Having said that, I think one point I'd like to re-emphasize is the audit committee's role. And I think amongst all the plethora of committees that companies have, audit committee, nominating committee, CSR committee, risk management committee, governance committee, and you can name them, and they have a number of them. Audit committee happens to be one of the most important committees in a company. And especially it becomes far more complicated in companies which are in the financial sector, or for that matter, companies where they've got hundreds of subsidiaries. Is the audit committee focused on looking at the inter-corporate lending, intra-group lending? What are the kind of interest rate? Are they really arm's length? Are there any round tripping taking place? What is the purpose of the loan? I think a lot of these questions, if they have to spend with 130 subsidiary companies, it's not enough if they spend a half a day. I think it needs to go through a far more in-depth review of the whole thing and taking an expert help if need be. I think it's important. But having said that, I don't want to repeat any of them, what they have said. I'd like to add a few more additional points because I think the subject is a very vast subject because the number of committees are there. One of the points which just to add to what Amit said about experts being brought into the committee or experts' opinion being taken, I would go one step further. As he said rightly, the board members are not equipped with all the necessary knowledge to question on every aspect of it. On the one hand, the knowledge is limited and they don't have the skills as well. And especially in the current regime where plethora of regulations keep coming every day, are they up to date on the regulation? So here one point I find it very useful, some companies do that effectively, is there's a periodic training for the independent directors and the directors where we get the big 4, big 5, whatever number of people that you want. Half a day is only on training and 4 or 5 topics are taken, whether it's cybersecurity or in terms of specialization, in terms of areas. Then we have that session focused on that to understand what are the latest developments and what kind of frauds have taken place in the system in a variety of fields all across the globe, so that we are aware of how to probe some of these issues when in the audit committee. So I thought in addition to getting expert, I think it will be useful for companies to actually have training program for exposing the board members with new knowledge and whatever developments that are taking place. The second area we talked about the risk management. I think both of them covered a lot on risk. But here again, I find that many companies get confused with risks which are external and risks which are internal. Sometimes I find the discussion takes place on real operational matters where the management is responsible for a few things and they call it a risk. I said, I mean, that's your responsibility. How can you call it a risk? It's not uncertain. Risk is perforce uncertainty. But I think, can we avoid risk? In the morning, we had a lot of discussions. You can't eliminate risk. After all, if you eliminate risk, you won't do business. Business is done with certain amount of risk that is there in the future. But the question is, can we focus to understand what are those risks which are likely to take place? What is the probability if we can do some assessment? And what are the mitigation strategies? That's the only thing that you can do, so that we are prepared for taking the action. And board has to facilitate the process of risk discussion. Apart from the legal responsibility that the board is supposed to discuss the risk aspect, there are risk management committees in very many companies, but again, it is basically gracing the surface and not really going into depth and understanding what are the enterprise risks. And particularly in today's context, with changing technology, with social media being so fast, we find that a risk that has a reason can spoil the image of the company in few seconds, not in days, not in months. So given that, are you prepared how to face it? Do you have strategies for proper communication, managing the media, managing the environment to ensure that the image of the company is not lost, though there are issues? It could be a fraud, it could be any kind of thing that has happened, or in terms of a market risk, suddenly something happens in the market and you wipe off major part of your reserve. So we need to understand how to tackle this, and I think boards have to spend a lot of time in looking at the risk management. Another area which is very important, which companies miss out in today's context, is the nomination remuneration committee and the board is responsible for succession planning. How many companies actually do succession planning? It's one area where I think it's a misnomer. We have seen many companies, one fine morning the CEO is not there or is fired, we don't know who is going to be the next person. I keep emphasizing in companies that, listen, even if you don't have a written down plan, do you have a system, do you have a process of identifying talent? Some companies do a very good job. If it's a large group company, they keep rotating talent, they keep creating people who can handle different business at different points of time. And if that is not focused on Indian companies, you have idea. In one of the companies, I asked the CEO, I said, do you have a succession planning? I was so amazed that he came so clearly in terms of what his thinking is. I said, fair enough, I'm happy that you know what you are doing, you know what your plans are, you know what you will do in case of an emergency. But I'm happy at least keep the board informed so that in case something happens to you, the board knows what to do. So I think it's important to have this exposure and discussion constantly. This is one area where I think many companies are failing, and we have seen it in the realm of last few years, or what happened in companies where taken months and years to have a new successor taking on the role of a company, both in public sector and in private sector. I think it's not exclusive to private sector. These are a few things which I find that from the board's perspective, I think many times we keep kind of confusing from boards. Do the boards engage the committees to ask questions? So what does the committee do? Talking about agenda fixation, it's equally important that in many companies, what the boards do is just get the minutes of the committee meetings and pass through minutes that have been read, and that's done. I feel it's important that each committee chair should be asked to brief the board in terms of what transpired in the committee, because what is written in the minutes is just a summary. It may not have all the information that got discussed or the kind of issues that are being faced, kind of challenges being faced. So I think one of the important things the board has to do a responsibility is to ensure that the committee chair is given some time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on the size of the committee, to brief the board in terms of what are the issues that are being discussed, what are the challenges. I think that's a very important aspect in the, what are the board's role. So board's primary role is to improve performance of the organization, and secondary role in the process of improving performance, they ensure the governance. Today it is being too topsy-turvy, and so much of importance is given to compliance and rules and regulations and ticking the box and so on. I think very little time is spent on the real performance improvement. We discussed in the morning as well. So I think using the committees to give feedback to the board and looking at what are the challenges, and then the board deliberating on how to overall improve the performance of the company should be given far more importance, and we should engage the committees in that process. And I would stop here, and I think leave it to something. I want to ask you a question.
Please.
You talked about the composition of the committees are very important. Okay? Tell me, in real practice, who decides the committee members? Is it the chairman, promoter, or is it the nom-rem committee which is supposed to do the job? Are they having the independence to decide the members?
I think we are going through a transition phase. As you rightly said, if I go back 30, 35 years, it used to be an old boys club. You will see the same group of people are there they will all. Recently, we are seeing a group of professional promoters. It's a new term which has come up, is that they behave like promoters, but they are professionals. There, the problem is even more difficult, because I don't know, and we saw that, he said a chairperson, and then he added something, that you bring people you are comfortable with.
So that's where it is. I mean, so
no,
how do you change it?
but I am seeing that thing moving. Have we reached that stage? The answer is no. And that's where I go back to what you had said, that it's actually the job of the Nomination Remuneration Committee to do that. And what has happened is that, promoters don't have a sense of insecurity. So they still are open. I find that these others are more difficult to deal with. I'm not generalizing, I'm just talking about this thing. And I think the Nomination Remuneration Committee has to play a role, because you can't expect CEO or chairman to be know-all. The second point I like to make, in addition to what you said, I think NRC's role does not end with only the CEO. How many times NRCs meet the next level? If you're a marketing-driven company, your CMO is as important as the CEO. And so I go back to where I started, that you need to, we are going through transition. I must say that things have changed substantially since in the last few years. The independent directors are seeing the responsibilities in far greater light, rather than just feeling elated that I've been invited by such and such board to join. I think that period has gone. I think the private equity is playing a very important role, because where they have a stake, and they will make sure that they do the full search to get those people. But I would be lying if I said that we have reached that stage. I think there are few companies who've reached the stage, but I think there is still a long distance to go. And what Amit said is correct, that I think the boards need to be more enlightened, because the boards need to understand The independent directors need to understand periodically what their roles and responsibilities are, because we live in a very dynamic world.
One is on the committee membership, which you talked about, but Amit, I'd like you to answer this question that even today I am told that many companies, even the board members are chosen by the promoter, chairman, depending on their convenience of who will match the culture, who would kind of comply with and so on and so forth. Is there any change that you see is actually the Nom Rem committee playing the role of actually selecting the directors who join the board?
Yeah. So let me answer that question, but let me, before I do that, build a little bit on what Arun said. And one of the privileges I've had is serving on US boards as well. And just picking up a little bit from that experience, because the interesting thing about US companies is very few of them are promoter driven.
Yeah.
And so you see a very different kind of a dynamic at play in US firms. And so if you compare and contrast that with the Indian environment, there are some interesting learnings that you get. And one of the companies that I've served on the US boards or US board of, what I noticed is the process, because there wasn't necessarily a promoter, was that the chairman slash in that case the chairman and CEO are not the same person, basically left the task of board revamp to the NRC. I'm on the NRC there, and said that, look, broadly, let's agree on the key principles. The key principles were, over a long period of time, because you don't want to, have all the changes done in a short period of time. For a long period of time, let's identify what are the key requirements for this board. So you basically say that, we're a technology company. We essentially want someone with artificial intelligence, someone with robotic, process automation capability, someone with, and then some functional capabilities, marketing, etc. So you say, these are the capabilities that we are looking for. Then you define that, okay, in addition to this, what are the other things that we are looking for? I'm coming to your question on cultural requirements. In that case, we said, most companies have a low bar that we want to have X percentage women. We said we want to have at least, half our board members ideally as women. So you define these are additional requirements that we'd like to have. Then you say, okay, we'd like, maybe some board members from Europe, etc. So we left then, we took those directions to the NRC and let the NRC drive the process, and then have a set of candidates, and then have the CEO as a part of the interviewing panel along with the NRC members. So it's very interesting when you actually have a process driven that way by the NRC, it's efficient, what comes out of it. We've actually, in that case, revamped over a period of time the entire board, and actually it's landed up being a pretty good, very nice, functional kind of board with filling all the gaps that we wanted to fill. And when I compare that to, in India, when I hear about, where promoters really try to control, hey, I really want to make sure that this person will listen to what I want. And it's driven a little bit more by that as opposed to, the skills that you want to solve for, etc. You'll end up actually getting more of groupthink. So in my mind, I think if we land up, letting NRCs follow broad process, strategic requirements of a company, and you still can have, as a shareholder, some veto that, hey, this person is, inimical to me, I don't want this person.
Maybe a disruptive person.
Disruptive person, and you can always have a right to turn down someone. But I think trust your NRC to throw up interesting names and let them guide processes. I think you'll actually get much further along in terms of board compositions.
Experience that I've had in an Indian company, which is not common, and I think we're all in the journey, as Arun said, is that it is not only that at the board and at the NRC we kind of decided what kind of profile of directors we wanted. Then when we choose a potential candidate, the entire board interviews him individually.
I think that's very
I mean,
impractical.
no, but we did that.
Yeah.
And I think, well, it's not.
I mean, it's difficult, well, especially if you have large board. Most boards are between
large board is
9,
difficult,
10
I agree
people.
with you. If it's not
You
a
have
too
small
large a
boards, you
board,
can do that.
5-6 member board.
Then it's okay.
What was important in that, the process, what I was happy with is that each person spent a lot of time and then did the
Yeah.
exchange of ideas and say, listen, is he the person who's going to really add more value and question us? Not just can be a yes person, not a compliant person, but he will add value to the board. Anyway, it's not practical, as you said. If the board is large, you can't do that.
Yeah.
But on smaller boards, you can try that.
Yes, smaller boards you can do that. 4, 5 member boards you can probably.
And then now with that, I think what I'll like to do is.
Sorry, Arun has.
Yes, sure, go ahead.
I want to make 2 points from where Amit said. I think he made a very important point about the chairman and CEO. And in US, that is why you find less problems in Europe, where the professional CEO is not the chairman of the board.
Yeah, that's true.
And in US, professional CEOs have become big honchos. They become more difficult to deal with than promoter shareholders. And one more thing I'd like to say, I think we are sometimes overcritical of the promoter.
Oh yeah, that also I agree.
I mean, I served on a board where you had Deepak Parekh, Dr. Ganguly, Mr. Wagul, and I can name. I don't think any of those people you could phone and say, boss, I've got this resolution, you can.
Yeah.
One company's name was mentioned. That agenda had to be discussed. It was in the 3rd board meeting. Twice the board sent it back. They said, please do this homework. I want to know what are the risks of class action. Quantify, get up for this thing.
Absolutely.
So there are Indian company boards which are, I don't think, otherwise Mr. Damodaran would not have been on any private promoter-driven board if he could be influenced into taking a decision. But the point is that the journey is still, I feel that type of companies are fewer than the others. I was personally surprised this morning newspaper of one of the companies which we thought was very well managed and had a huge growth with that sort of a story in the front page of a major daily. Actually, it made me feel uncomfortable.
I'll pose one more question to both of you, then open it to the public. With all the changes that are taking place on the so-called independent directors arena, on the one hand, responsibility is going up, as he said, personal assets being attached and anything that could happen in terms of risk. On the other hand, there is a lot of committees which are looking at compensation being reduced in a quote-unquote illogical manner of limiting it to 20-25%. The total compensation to the director, how will they decide what will be the practical aspects? I don't know, but anyway, that's what the suggestion is coming in. So this independent directors as a species is to start with getting endangered and ultimately become extinct. So given this context, what do you think is the challenge for the Indian boards to get quality independent directors to do all that we are talking about? We want governance, we want proper contribution, we want capability, we want to ensure that people have the right knowledge, and we are talking all this is fantastic, esoteric. Do you think we are going to get good quality independent directors wanting to take risk and be on the boards of company? We have decided that a lot of companies, people are leaving, seven directors have left over the last few weeks, things going down, immediately they walk out of the whole place and so on. So given this, what is the challenge that we're going to face over the next few years to get high quality independent directors who want to put their personal risk on table and become contributing to the company? What do you think are the challenges?
Should I? Sandile, you've asked
knowledge first, intelligence first, wisdom later.
But you've asked an extremely important question. This is not just a question that's important, by the way, for independent directors, but it's also an important question for executives.
Also.
I'm sure there's some people in this audience who attended a roundtable where we had one of the leading lights from the headhunting industry who was visiting India, and she made a very interesting observation that one of the trends that she's seeing is that many executives in their 40s are actually, after having made a certain amount of money globally, are deciding to retire, okay? And I'm not surprised. I think part of why they're doing that is essentially that, they look at it and say, why do we need to deal with all this complexity and risk? if you think about that, that obviously applies to independent directors as well. I mean, why take all this risk? Why deal with all this nonsense? You know, especially as an independent director, you actually have, you're not even in control of the situation. As an executive, you at least have much greater degree of knowledge and control. As an independent director, you're sitting on the back seat. Sometimes somebody else is driving the car. So I don't, unfortunately, have a good answer to this, because often you're doing diligence on the person, and sometimes when cases of fraud, you know, you could just be taken for a ride. Of course, you know, there are some cases where you could be asking the obvious questions and getting some answers, when lots of cases, you know, you could just be taken for a ride. I do think that we will see, before things get brighter, we will see more darkness. There will be fewer and fewer people who will put their hand up to be independent directors, quality people. You will see the wrong sort of people wanting to be independent directors of companies. And, you know, recently I saw, for example, in one situation, very prominent one, where you saw the right names get off the boards of a prominent entity, and when you saw the names of who was there, none of us could recognize the names of the board members there. Not to say that those people aren't reputed, but it's just they are not of eminence. And so I think basically what will happen is you will see more and more such instances where only people who have less skin in the game, less both reputational and otherwise, will gravitate towards a particular situation. And that's truly unfortunate. I think we need more people to come into the pool. And I think part of this actually should go to the regulator's doorstep. And Arun touched upon a very important issue, which is, it's not just the regulator, it goes to the judiciary's doorstep, which is what kind of actions they need to take, you know, including attaching, you know, people's personal assets. I mean, you know, what kind of signs they are sending.
And you want to comment? Brief comment that we can open to the public.
You know, I agree with Amit, but there are two things that I like to say here. You know, one of the problems in India, and I don't know about US, is that we look for trophy directors. We look for people of eminence. Now, there are a lot of people who may not be that, they may not have that profile in public space, but they have a lot of good domain knowledge. And I think we have to start, if we really want our boards to be this thing, we need little more, because typically independent directors are retired senior people. I think we'll have to, you got on the board of Tata Sons at the age of, in your 30s?
The 40s.
Yeah, you know, no. But here is a, no, I'm not trying to, but here's a professional in his career, gets onto the Tata Sons board. There cannot be a more prestigious board than. So we have to go and look for people. And I have a request to the companies that today we should encourage some of our executives to join other board, because it also, this is, you know, we talk of training. He's sitting on the board, he will be a better CEO tomorrow.
Absolutely. I think what's
you know, because today you cannot get a person who's working, suppose you want somebody with brand, if you go to Levers and talk one of their brand managers to come, he'll say, sorry, my job conditions don't permit me to do that. And I think we have to get on to that.
Companies have to open up. I think now we'll open it to the audience. Please raise your hand, say who is speaking, whom do you want to ask a question. Ashank, you have a question?
That's a good point.
Ashank.
Can you get the mic? And the second person, please raise your hand so that we can get the mic to you in time.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out an anomaly. I'm not an expert on Companies Act, but is there any provision to solve this anomaly? And it goes like this. We make subcommittees of importance by making them independent of management promoters, saying that independent, like audit committee, NRC, and so on. So there is a provision to make that happen. At this, so there is an assumption that there would be an independent decision, which is, you know, taken with independent mind. At the same time, we say that all the subcommittee decisions are to be passed by the board. So now suppose NRC comes and says, I take your example just as a case in point, that NRC comes and says, I want these people on the board. But the board and a powerful chairman or CEO or chairman CEO comes and doesn't agree, or some dynamics happen there and it is not agreed. So what is the use of having an independent audit committee and NRC chairman? The point I'm saying is there anything which in Companies Act provides for a subcommittee chairman saying, no, I don't agree the board decision, my view is final?
If I can say,
Yes, please, yeah.
no,
So I
no,
just
no,
a query.
no, it's the other way around. If the board can veto it, but you cannot appoint somebody unless he has been recommended by the NRC.
Yes, that's true.
That's a point.
So there is a check there. You cannot. Suppose you as NRC want me to join this thing and the chairman of the board doesn't agree, he cannot get another person of his choice unless the NRC agrees to that.
Yes.
You cannot, the accounts cannot be adopted if the audit committee has not approved it. Related party transactions cannot be approved. So there are checks built the other way around, not in the way you are saying it.
There is one more check, Shank, that the chairman of the company cannot be the chairman of the Nom-Rem committee. I'm just giving you one point.
That's okay.
And there must be 3 independent directors in the Nom-Rem committee. In other words, as he said very clearly, unless the Nom-Rem committee recommends a candidate, the board just cannot approve. So therefore, there is a
It's
check.
one way, but what he is saying is okay.
Yeah.
What you are saying is that the process restarts again.
It has to go back to ground zero.
And so on, it can go on at technical level. But
Hota
yeah,
hai.
I agree.
Hota hai.
Yeah. Yeah, you had some question. I'll come back to you. Thomas, I'll
Matthew.
come back to you. I think there is a question. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is addressed to Mr. Amit Chandra. As Mr. Sandelia rightly stated, that there is a need for the board to effectively monitor the operations of the committees, board committees. And we appreciate that you just mentioned that you have had you've been on the board of certain US companies. So in US companies and UK companies, there is one more committee which is conventionally christened as the executive committee of the board, which is like a board office.
Yes.
And so would like to get some feedback from you, sir, that what is the impact the executive committee has on the monitoring of the committee performance by the board?
Yeah. So I'm not that familiar with UK, but US I'm a little familiar with. I think, it's actually very useful because the executive committee essentially, acts as like a office of the board, minus the the management of the, of the company. And it's really useful because what we do is, we'll have a meeting of the board after the board meeting without the CEO and his or her team to review everything, including the, the management performance. And it's actually quite refreshing because we get an opportunity at that meeting to, often discuss, for example, an issue that you raised was the agenda set rightly, because often it starts actually with that item, because otherwise, often the agenda is set between the chairman and the CEO of the company. It starts with review of that, the conduct of the meeting. Do we think the right issues were tabled? Was the right time set for tabling for each of the items? Do we think at the next meeting some different items should be tabled? The performance of the people who showed up and discussed, because one of the things that we try to make sure is that it's not just the CEO talking, but the broader team showing up, making sure that all the subcommittees have had a chance to speak, and that is discussed. And then very importantly, that group then, develops some sort of consensus around the proceedings of that entire meeting, and then empowers the chairperson to go back and give feedback to the CEO post the meeting. I've actually found it to be a very, very helpful setting.
Absolutely, and I think this is something which in one of the boards we follow very strictly. Every quarter we have specific time allotted for the independent directors to meet.
Yeah.
it is their decision to meet or not to meet. If they meet and they have a viewpoint, they immediately call the CEO and they also promoters to give them feedback in terms of what the independent directors had to say. I think it's a very important process. I don't know,
I was going to say the same thing, because many companies are following that process. In fact, in our group, for example, the independent director meets an hour before the board meeting and the other meeting, because then it gives them an opportunity then at the board meeting, because they review things like this. And so the independent directors meeting takes care of more or less what you're saying.
Thomas, you had a question?
I want to throw one controversial question to this thing. Let Thomas Matthew go first.
Then you get back to
We have discussed at length that going forward, we require very competent, quality, ethical, independent directors with skin in the game. In that context, I feel that there should not be any limit to the number of terms or the maximum age limit. What is your comment and what is the international practice on this?
International, I think Amit will be able to contribute.
I actually don't know what the term limit in most places are. I actually believe in term limits, personally. I think having, 2 terms is probably good because, otherwise it puts you in a little bit of a cozy relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the point.
With others, even if you're ethical, etc. So I personally believe it's good to have term limits, and I think maybe 2 terms is generally a good limit. I actually haven't checked what the US law on term limits is. Maybe I don't know whether you're aware of what the term limit is. I can check, so I'll definitely get back to you on that.
But in India also, it's only certain companies have
certain companies have term limits.
Age limit.
Yes.
But I think all these are done.
But it's much more code. It's done much more by a code in India than by
now it's a SEBI code.
Yeah, that's a SEBI code has come in. But I'm just saying earlier, it's been one of what each company feels like. Now, of course, even the age has come in as at 75 when you go to special resolution, but still permitted. It's not that it's not permitted.
Non-executive director beyond a period of 6 years should be subject to a rigorous review, keeping into mind the progressive refreshing of the board.
Yes, so that's not really a term limit. That's what I'm saying. I am aware of that, and I know that the review happens. I'm serving on one board for the 6th year, but I don't know. That's not really a term limit.
You want to ask a question, Arun? I think Thomas.
I want to ask a question to to the audience. What do you think of this board performance? Because this is something I have always been, there are 2 views on this.
If I could add to your question, how many people actually rate a board member poorly?
I have done it.
No, we have done that. In a few companies, we have in fact asked board members to leave anyway. I think with that, let's stop. I think time is up. We just very little time.
Mr. Damodaran wants a question.
Since you asked, the process of evaluation has been going on for the last 4 years. So 4 into the number of companies that are forced to undertake evaluation. Not one single director has lost his or her board position as a result of evaluation. If they've gone home for other reasons, that's a different matter. Being found to be this, as a result of evaluation, nobody has lost.
Well, I have a different experience, so I don't get into that discussion.
Are we out of time?
No, we are out of time. I think we need to close the session. But Aman, I think it's rare. I totally agree with you. But there are rare cases, but once in a while it happens, yes. Okay. With that, I think let's close the session.
Just on a small anecdote, with due respect from my friends from the IS, I sit on the board, there were 2 IS officers. One was a retired office officer who was retired as a chief secretary, and one was the current secretary industries. So he says, I am so and so batch, he is 10 batches junior, how can he evaluate me?
Oh.
It happened in one of the boards that I sit on.
Let me share one more secret with you, since we are doing IAS bashing at this time.
No, I'm not doing IAS bashing. अरे वो मारेगा मेरे को जयराम रास्ते में मारेगा तो पता नहीं चलेगा.
I have no problem with that. When I was chairman IDBI, I had 2 IAS officers, a couple of years senior to me, ex officio on my board. And when I did the merger of the bank with the IDBI, these were the 2 guys who could not decide whether to support or not because they were unable to connect. We were having the meeting in Hyderabad. They were unable to connect to the minister on the phone.
That's a lot of independence. There's a lot of independence. I think with that we close this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chandelier, Mr. Nanda, and Mr. Chandra. If I could request Mr. Subodh Bhargav to please come up and present mementos to our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we're really running short of time, so we're about 15 minutes short. Although we have tea and refreshments outside, I would encourage only those who really need to go out to get yourself a cup of tea may do so. But if you still want to go out and get yourself some beverage, then please do so. Bring it inside and we will start our session, which is going to be the last session.